All right, and we are live yet again, Alex. And so I guess we're going to pick up on camera where we left off camera or off recording last time. We started talking about Daniel Dennett and death and what the experience of death is like within the context of this idea of the radical otherness, radical beyond, liminality and that kind of thing. And what I was thinking then is I kind of wanted to look at this in terms of identity, right? Because the way that death really is an ultimate liminality, even if you believe in survival beyond death, it's still that ultimate limit in a sense with regards to the boundaries of one's identity, I think. So I want to bring in Whitehead a little bit here to kind of kick us off, because the way that Whitehead really, like the idea of death and immortality and the eternal, these are things that were really in the background for Whitehead in a big way throughout many of his writings, which probably had a lot to do with the death of his son in World War One, right? And so the way, early on at least, the way that he's conceptualizing immortality is in terms of objectification. This idea that the past is immortalized through its objectification. And so this essentially allows for this view where the past and the dead within the past are still there, but they're not, the subjectivity isn't there anymore. They are kind of just carved into stone after that, because the past can't unhappen. Subjectivity is a process of actualization, and if the past is complete, as it were, then there's nothing for subjectivity to do. But then at the very end of Process and Reality, Whitehead talks about this in a little bit of a different way. He gets very mystical in a good way. He starts talking about this idea that the past is created, and then it's through God, through the consequent nature of God, as he calls it, that there's this kind of feedback loop that happens where the past is kind of constantly being regenerated into the present. And so it's interesting here that at the very end there, his idea of immortality seems to be a lot more active than the way that he thinks of it early on. And I think this has a lot to do with the fact that in the process of creating Process and Reality, he discovers this idea of hybrid prehension, which I've argued corresponds to Sheldrake's morphic resonance, Bergson's idea of recollection. It really is a kind of recreation of the past. But within Whitehead's framework, the way that he thinks of it, it's the inheritance, so the recapitulation of the mental aspects of past actualities, as opposed to the just dominoes knocking each other over type of physical inheritance of the past. And so this opens up, it would seem, the possibility of subjectivity, of the mental realm continuing to be an active participant in the present, even after it is in some sense gone into the past. It is not merely objectified. It can continue to be a participant in the present. And so if we think about this then in terms of our own subjectivity, you could think of it like this, like your entire timeline of your life is in a sense still here inside of you in some sense. Like the 7-old version of you is still present, but it's nested within something that is bigger, because it's a version of you that also includes everything that happened since then. And so it's all kind of formed into a superorganism. When we think of the symbiosis of consciousness, we tend to think of it in geometric terms, that the different cells and organ systems and neural processes in your body all come together to form that Kantian synthetic unity of apperception. But we could also look at this as stretched out over time as well, right? We could look at all the past actualities of our existence as essentially being kind of like organs of our present consciousness in some sense. There's a sense in which the you that's active right now could be seen as being kind of sacrificed into like a, what you're going to be 5 minutes from now or whatever. It's still there, but it's like this particular iteration isn't at the helm anymore. You're kind of passing the baton to the next moment of your being. And death then is kind of the part where somebody else has to take the baton, because you're going to have that same thing. You're going to, that particular moment of the end of your life is going to be incorporated into the future, but that's where the boundary of identity is, right? That's when it's you're not giving yourself up into more you anymore. You really are giving yourself up into a radical otherness, as we said last time. So anyway, that's what I was thinking about, and I'll just leave it at that. So
What a beginning. Well, I recently finished reading the last book by David Ray Griffin, who was a theologian and one of the greatest Whiteheadians of the previous century. He is actually one of the editors, right, of Process and Reality, the guys that took the pains to correct the manuscripts and the notes. Yes, right there. And he wrote many books. And the last one was called On Life and Death, or On Life After Death, or something like that, on James and Whitehead. And so if you haven't read it, it's very pertinent to what you're saying, because in it, he goes through the Whiteheadian jargon and speaks about precisely what you just explained so, I would say, so eloquently about objective immortality being there in Whitehead. And then he says, well, Hartshorne, who was, let's say, the philosopher who took the baton from Whitehead, and then came David Griffin and so on, what wouldn't open the door for life after death in his interpretation of Whitehead. But then in this book, which is a very short book, actually, Griffin says that if you read Whitehead in his estimation, he's not arguing for life after death, but that his pan-experientialist philosophy leaves the door open. So on the one hand, we had, as if it were the kind of the philosophical operating system allows for something survival after what we call bodily death. And then the other part of the book speaks about James. And in case of James, it's not so much his metaphysical system, but more his active research into those matters. And then in it, Griffin speaks about what's in his opinion the best available evidence. And so he speaks about reincarnation and so on. And he says pretty intriguing things, which maybe derail us here, but he also speaks about what kind of souls would living beings need to have for them in the process of evolution and creativity happening and so on, for them to be able to carry on. And for instance, he says a very perhaps unpopular opinion, which is that probably dogs and cats and so on don't continue, right? But we do. For instance, he has this opinion, and also makes once more the necessary Whiteheadian summary, which when you're reading it, you think you get it, and then the moment you close the book, it's like, oh shit, all of that has gone. But he explains again prehensions and the poles, and with them, he also dives into psychical phenomena, and in a way explains them all under this Whiteheadian framework, except for retrocausality, which is something that's another interesting thing, something that Griffin cannot accept. But for all the rest, basically what he says is, well, with pan-experientialism, the prior probability of life after death is not zero as materialism. So let's say it's 0.5, so we don't know. And then with all the other evidence of psychic phenomena, builds the case that it's quite likely. And well, I've spent some time, but I haven't finished kind of sketching all the understanding that it allows for the different categories of clairvoyance and telepathy and psychokinesis, micro psychokinesis, and which, by the way, on some future occasions, maybe we can feed back into our discussions about physics and matter and so on. But well, just as an introduction, like you did, it's something that I'm very interested to find a framework to think through as well, not as opposed, like in complement to the so-called evidence, which the dogmatic skeptics would immediately deny as to whether there's a scientific way of investigating whether there's survival after bodily death.
Yeah. So, well, I suppose that that really brings us back to the identity thing then. If there's a pan-experiential continuity of consciousness, and the question isn't really whether consciousness continues, there's the question of whether identity continues in any sense. And maybe it does. So the from what I've gathered from the kind of like Old Norse Germanic view of reincarnation, they did not see the soul as being something that necessarily participated in reincarnation per se. There were different layers to the soul, as you see within lots of traditions like this, and their view was that there was one particular layer of the soul which could then reiterate itself in subsequent persons. But this had to be kind of built up in a way over time. It had to be adequately purified spiritually or what have you in order to do so. And so this is interesting to me, I think, because if we're taking into account these ideas of the regeneration of the past into the future, then what would it actually take for something like a singular human identity to be part of the blueprint that the universe is working with subsequently? It's not terribly hard to imagine that, organs like hearts and kidneys could be built up over time through this kind of morphic resonance and whatnot, and then reiterated through the development of biological systems. But the human self is also an organ of the human being. Could it be that there are in fact a finite number of different models that you can be running on, as it were? This is an interesting idea because then that raises the question as to whether or not um, there is something eternal about them or not. So if we're talking about the idea of like archetypes, for example, and this idea that there's this kind of in-between space, as it were. So you've got the world of actuality, things happening, particular events and whatnot. Then you've got at the top, as it were, you've got the pure transcendentals, the form of the good, the mathematical Pythagorean objects or what have you that exist in this just like purely eternal way. And then it's somewhere kind of in between those two that you would have these morphic fields or the different kind of blueprints of what Whitehead would call the mental poles, which are kind of sculpted by hybrid prehension. Um, and in a lot of ways, I think you can see this really kind of dynamic relationship between these different layers, because a lot of the time I think what you'll have is this thing where the blueprint that gets carved out isn't just being made up on the fly. There's this reflection of the truly, purely eternal in that, for example. So if we look at something like trees or leaves, for example, we could imagine that those are just a peculiarity of the Earth's biosphere or whatever, but maybe there's another sense in which the archetype of the leaf is somehow implicated within the very structure of the very possibility of there being a universe at all, and so that fundamental archetype gets iterated in some way. So then we could ask, well, maybe the idea of human selfhood in a very general sense is already there in the anachronon or the Platonic heaven or whatever. But could there actually be particular persons up there too? Could it be that individual human personalities might actually have a kernel that is on the same order as like a mathematical object? I don't know, but that's a wild one to think about. So
All right, well, wild terrain here, because I've had already three thoughts as you're exposing these. So I'll sketch them and you decide the next step in our adventure. But one is, so I reached this last Sunday. I was invited to a conference here in Spain about life after death, precisely. And when people were asking towards the end, and we went into these kind of discussions. Well, if there's reincarnation, then well, do all of those people, those souls come back, and when and what happens with the other ones that don't come back? And is there some sort of a factory of souls where as the population is increasing, more are produced because they're needed and so on? Or are others put on the waiting list? And of course I realized this is fine, but this is a very physical, actual 19th century way about for thinking about those things. And then it reminded me of, and I know this when one brings quantum physics, it's always like, oh no, don't do it. But no, I mean it in this sense. When people are trying to understand entanglement, for instance, right?
right.
Well, if you try to think entanglement, which is a genuinely quantum phenomenon, via classical ways of thinking, which we inevitably do, right? Then most of what you say just defeats the purpose. It's like, well, of course, I mean, this is here and this is there, and then these parts should send. No, they are not going to send a signal. And no, you shouldn't think in terms of this is here and this is there, right? So for those of us who've thought a little bit about that, realize that that's precisely what the quantum world brings you, the necessity to think in terms of a different order of things, not just different ideas. And that's why, for instance, Einstein was so opposed to non-locality, because it's just a different game. So in the same way, when we imagine what survives as we cross the threshold and where it goes, and it is as if something was crossing as some sort of filter and something gets through and another thing doesn't get through, which is the physical body. And then where does it go and when does it come back? I think all these notions are fundamentally flawed to think about them. So that's one thing. The other one that's related with it is, I think what's key here is what do we understand by a body? And when we say body, we tend to think of physical body, but there's so many ways it, with which we can talk about bodies, and there are all these Sanskrit terms that are used in different traditions to describe precisely kind of the seven layers, and some other bodies linger, and they say that's why you can sometimes feel the presence of somebody who's diseased, but he's really not there. But it's like, if you wish, kind of the electromagnetic, it's not that, but it's like the etheric kind of remains of that, and that also dissipates. It's very well explained, actually. And that's the kind of another body, and then there's another body. So well, there's this challenge of how do we think about bodies. And then the third thing, as you were talking about this selfhood, it came to mind that maybe we could think of that as, in the same way we speak about laws and habits, right? That there are laws of nature, and we say, well, we prefer to think of them like habits. Well, maybe ourselves as self-organizing processes are also mini habits, kind of mini laws. And perhaps we have some sort of inertia, right? Which means even if we die, well, there's something that he wants to continue because of this habitual nature of nature at all levels, right? And I never had this thought until you were talking about that. So maybe there's something that eventually decays, but that can continue because it has been formed through a lifetime.
Right. So this idea of inertia is really interesting to me, because I think this is another one of many ideas that gets used within physics and never really gets any kind of real like ontological or metaphysical treatment. But inertia is very interesting, right? There's this force, this tendency within nature by which things want to keep doing what they're doing. And we definitely see that in a kind of seemingly blunt way with what we call like kinetic inertia. Objects want to maintain their trajectories and will resist such changes. You have to apply force to get, something to accelerate into a different rest frame, as they say. But organisms in general have a kind of inertia. We try to continue perpetuating ourselves, and in fact, I think this really brings us close to the cusp of that very idea, that very anxiety we were talking about last time, with kind of like crossing that threshold into otherness, right? The human sense of ego, I suppose. Terms like that always have kind of wiggly meanings, and I hate using them sometimes because of that. But let's just call it the ego. Why not? Um, there's something about that which is really all about inertia. It's all about preserving and securing the motion that the self is already in. This is why it's riddled by anxiety. It is the part of us that most acutely feels the boundaries between self and world, between known and unknown. And it's all about um, trying to grasp hold of things, find something to anchor yourself to. So Heidegger talks about this in relation to Nietzsche in a very, very interesting way. He talks about how in a lot of ways, Nietzsche's philosophy of will to power is really just the logical conclusion of Descartes' inward turn. The way that Heidegger describes this, he says that the hypokaimenon, which in Greek is like the ultimate foundation of being, hypo, so under, that which is underneath everything, within the Hellenic, Platonic, Neoplatonic philosophy that was conceptualized as being the one or the monad or God or what have you. But within Descartes' philosophy, what happens is the hypokaimenon becomes the human subject. I think, therefore, I am becomes the epistemological core of the universe, as it were, but because the human subjectivity itself kind of becomes its own universe in a way. And when that happens, once we start identifying ourselves with that ego, with that inertia, then that inevitably leads to the metaphysics of will to power you see in Nietzsche, because the metaphysics of will to power, as Heidegger says, it is self-securing self-preservation. That's what it fundamentally is. That's why it wants to grasp and control and enframe the world. It's trying to secure itself. It's trying to bend the world to its will, to master the world, such that there are no threats to its ability to continue doing what it's doing. So there's a kind of inertia there. And this is where we could talk about, just the idea of letting go. The idea of just at some point you do have to pass the baton. At some point you do have to accept the fact that you're not in complete control. And maybe on some level, we could conceptualize that as just a thing that you force yourself to do via willpower or something like that. But maybe even more fundamentally, our ability to do that corresponds with our ability to properly identify where our selfhood actually is. I mean, we take it for granted that we feel ourselves to be some little BB of light somewhere, behind our eyeballs and our heads somewhere, but that feeling of locality is not something that you can take for granted. I mean, if you look at anthropology, the different cultures, they'll say that they feel themselves to be in their guts, in their viscera, that others will say that they feel themselves to be in kind of the heart or the lungs or even the throat. And I think that if we really pay attention to that, what's going on here is that the self, what we mean by the word I, can refer to different things. It doesn't necessarily have to refer to that kind of interior subjectivity that we take for granted in the modern world. It could refer to the body. It could refer to this feeling of continuity with one's family or tribe or kinship group or what have you. There are options here, right? And I think maybe what happens when we really feel that extremely acute anxiety at the very idea of death, what Ernest Becker talked about with his denial of death. The problem is not our inability to contend with the fact that we'll be dead. We've been doing that for thousands of years. But right now we have death anxiety, not just because we're materialists who thinks that it's just a void after that, but because the way that we identify ourselves as such a little pinprick of subjectivity, that itself results in an inability to let go. We've made ourselves so small that we've become these little black holes that we can't get out of anymore. So,
Yeah, I have this friend, Stephen Jenkinson, who's an author and a cultural activist in Canada, and he's written about death. One of the best books I've read on death. It's called Die Wise. And in it, he denounces that we live in a death phobic culture. And that's based on his experience, as he says, in the death trade, just accompanying people dying and their refusal to die, right? And you mentioned limits, and I think this is key. And you and I have been exchanging lots of messages this last week on the singularity and on Kurzweil, because I'm working on this and this idea of transcendence. And I use that word also, but in Ray Kurzweil's sense as well, through this kind of pseudo-religious techno approach, techno scientific approach, we will transcend. That's the singularity. And I was checking for the etymology of transcend, and it's to climb over, which also means to overcome the limits. So one must ask what limits in Kurzweil's sense, and of course for him the limits are basically the limits of our humanity, our frailties, and also the limits of nature. That's why his take is so, in my view, so completely preposterous. It's like we'll just fix everything that we see as a problem. That's the engineering perspective here, and problems here will be any every fucking limit we see around, whether it's aging or disease, or we want to fly or we want to live forever, anything. We'll just fix it technologically. Why? Because there's some trend that makes the amount of computations per second per dollar cheaper and cheaper, and then from that piece of data he extrapolates, and therefore because it's exponential we cannot imagine how fast this is progressing, and ultimately we'll be able to transcend. But I think precisely what it means to be a human being is to embrace those limits, to just be fine, even if it's tough. I mean, I don't want to die. Come on, I don't want to die. But even if it's tough, it's part of being a human being to inhabit those limits. And the moment you just want to get rid of the limits, and then, well, I think this is anti-human and anti-humane what comes as a consequence, right? So I don't think, I mean, I'm not arguing for, yes, for sure, everything is for granted and we'll continue. I think something goes on, but I also think that something very valuable just ends, and that celebrating those limits is really important. Um, and you can see what happens when people desperately fight against those limits.
right. And Kurzweil is a great example of that, I would say, right? So, I mean, I was talking about how we can identify our selfhood in different ways. We can attribute different parts of our being as to being the self. But there's also this kind of intersubjective gray area right there as well, which I kind of hinted at when I was saying, you could also see yourself as being like the blood in your veins, what connects you to your family or tribe or whatever. But this can go a lot further than that, right? You can we identify ourselves in some sense with our bodies. We don't feel like our, I don't know, the activity of our livers or whatever are within our conscious control. So there's something kind of other there. Like if your body starts messing up, you usually kind of feel like it's something happening to you, not something that you are doing. So again, there's a little bit of gray area there. But nonetheless, you've got this thing where you can almost imagine as these kind of concentric spheres, right? Like at the center, you've got whatever is like really you, and then you move out from there to, maybe your body, and then maybe your family, and so on and so forth. And ideally, it seems to me that you would want to have at least one layer of that circle encompass nature, because we are nature. That's that we're made out of nature, right? And Kurzweil seems to not really feel that way about it, or about his body for that matter. Kurzweil really heavily buys into this kind of neo-Darwinian idea that, the biological world, like they'll pay lip service to it and say, oh, yes, it's beautiful, the nature. Oh, but like when it actually comes down to it, they think that biological organisms are just the products of this completely blind, stupid algorithm that just spits out stuff that happens to replicate genes. So
Yeah.
I mean, there's this bit that Neil deGrasse Tyson does all the time, where he talks about like, oh, if there was an intelligent designer, then he would never put what was it, a theme park in a sewage pipeline or something. He was talking about like the human like digestive and reproductive systems, and so that's how he sees it. He sees uh, our composition as deeply flawed in some way, and Kurzweil feels that way too. And how could they not? I mean, if you really think that nature is just doing whatever, and you think that you could do better, then why wouldn't you, right? But if you take that to the extreme, you get this thing with what you see with Kurzweil and then the other transhumanist people, this idea that we should just leave behind the body itself, that we should just leave behind nature itself. I mean, as though a supercomputer could just do better than nature. And they unironically, they feel that way quite genuinely, because they believe that human beings are capable of a top-down design, which is fundamentally better because it's more purposive than the purely bottom-up quasi design, the blind watchmaker that is what we see in the natural world. And so Kurzweil, again, this contraction of the self is happening here. Kurzweil does not feel like he is a part of nature. He doesn't even feel like he's his body, really. He feels like he's this little pinprick behind his eyeball somewhere that he's really hoping he can upload into a fucking computer so that can continue. Because for him, it's like, well, what else is there to continue? And that's really what we got to understand here, I think, is that there's actually a lot more to us than that just sense of a perspectival point that looks out on the world. There's quite a number of things that can indeed continue. So
Yes, and it has all these religious themes that when I rediscover them reading Kurzweil and the rest, I'm shocked and also amused, right? Because there's this idea of kind of redemption of the flesh, right? Like as you're saying, nature is some sort of suboptimal machinery, and so we can finally just get it right and fix it, and not just fix it, like asymptotically improve it and even make it transcend to whatever beyond the horizon of the black hole. Who knows what is there, but for sure is the kingdom of heaven. Even the name, the singularity is near. It's from Matthew, isn't it? Like the kingdom of heaven is near. He said that. I mean, it's even the motto, even the t-shirt motto is borrowed from Christianity, and then they'll do that, of course, with whatever they have in at hand, which is technology. And well, there's another thing that comes to mind, speaking about this point of light, whatever it is. And for this, I need to throw in first an understanding I got from Bergson, from Henry Bergson. In one of his amazing lectures, he says, well, this order is the order you're not looking for, you're not expecting. And then he speaks about nothingness, and he says, well, actually, nothingness nothing is more than something. And he's not playing with words here. He says, well, actually, nothing is, you have something because you always have something, and then you pretend that it's not there, so you just put it somewhere else, or um, imagine, pretend that it's not there. Therefore, nothingness is something plus that operation of just imagining it's not there. And this is great because, there is this chronological way of arguing for the fact that consciousness may have emerged somehow, somewhere, through the history of the universe and in our brains. And then there's the phenomenological approach. So it's like chronos versus kairos, right? And the phenomenology say, well, sure, whatever, you can argue that there was a time where there weren't humans and when there weren't living beings on Earth. And even you can just rewind as far as you want and say, well, look, there, there was there were these physical objects, matter, but mine wasn't there, and we have some clear evidence that that's the case. But then the phenomenologists say, yes, but you're saying that right here, right now, from your own conscious awareness, right? So I feel there's a struggle between the chronological argument and the phenomenological argument. Now, if you combine this with Bergson, I would conclude that there's a light, that there's a being there, that there's a consciousness and awareness. And we could say, what is it? Is it the self? What kind of, but that there's a light that's not only inextinguished, but inextinguishable. It should always be there because otherwise, where does it go? It's like a fire that cannot be um, put off ever. And I'm not sure if that's our own individual lives and consciousnesses and little black holes, but since at least I feel it now that I have this light, this awareness inside me as I'm talking to you, it's not something very metaphysical or mystical. I don't see how it can completely go away. It has to stay there forever because that's where everything comes from, as opposed to the chronological route, which inevitably ends in this kind of desperate solutions. Like, therefore, we're this kind of, like fortuitous machines that are doing philosophy. And by the way, I want to come back to Dennett and Dawkins and so on. But tell me what you think about this idea of that something that's aware that cannot come from nothing nor end up in nothing. I think that I don't see how this can happen.
So this is interesting because that idea of nothingness, yeah, it's a really interesting thought that, whenever you're imagining nothing, you're taking something and you're adding imagination to it in order to kind of negate it. But there's also a sense, I would say, in which um and instead of trying to imagine just a completely empty void, if we just think in terms of lack, in terms of formlessness, there's something to that too, right? A blank canvas in some sense has every possible painting within its, just white canvas. It's not yet been concretized yet. It's not yet been decided what it's going to be. And so it's kind of everything. So there's a weird sense here in which chaos transcends order because chaos is in some sense always going to be more than the order that is imposed upon it. But then there's, you can always flip this around and turn it into a weird loop. You could be like, okay, well, where is the order before it informs the chaos? And you could say, well, I mean, if it's going to be anywhere, that it's got to be in that chaos. It's just yet to be revealed. It's the David that has yet to be liberated from the marble by the hammer and chisel yet. And so there's this weird interpenetration there of form and formlessness, being and nothingness, order and chaos. And this is interesting because I feel like there's this kind of dual fixation if you look at these really maybe misguided strivings towards the transcendental. Um, on the one hand, you seem to have this kind of implicit deification of order, right? Again, think of Kurzweil and his idea of this mechanized, pristine world where everything looks like a freaking MacBook or whatever with the chrome and it's like got the nice curve to it and everything looks very clean and polished. But on the other hand, there's this indication within Kurzweil's thought of actually transcending individuality in some sense and creating this kind of like hive mind sort of thing. And I feel like that's really an expression of the opposite pole there, which is towards formlessness, towards kind of releasing oneself into this just oneness, which is the kind of thing you see throughout like every religious and spiritual mystical tradition. It's always there, this idea of I believe Meister Eckhart called it Gelassenheit. Hopefully, no one who speaks German is going to watch this and be absolutely appalled by my pronunciation. But either way, releasement is the idea. And you see that in Schelling and Heidegger as well. This idea of giving oneself up into the fullness of the pleroma of nature. Kurzweil wants so bad to do that too, but the problem is that um, he can't identify with nature in the way that Eckhart was able to say that the groundless ground beneath all being is the ground of both man and God. Eckhart could say that with a straight face and believe it. And I think that Eckhart was probably not afraid at all of dying because he believes that he would be incorporated into that. When Kurzweil looks at nature, he's like, I don't want to get incorporated into that because I'm just going to get eaten by the worm. So I need to make this other thing that I can get incorporated into. And maybe that way I can achieve transcendence. And again, it's what you find there is this disidentification with nature. But moving that along to the thing at the end there you were talking about with regards to uh, consciousness as something that can neither be created nor destroyed. I'm not sure if I really believe in destruction at all. When I look at the past in particular, I find a whole bunch of things that can't unhappen, right? Like, even after a person has lived their life and they're, dead in the ground getting eaten by the worms, that's still there. That's still got to be in some way or another part of this super being that we're a part of. And maybe we are potentially in danger of making a mistake by reifying aspects of our own consciousness. Maybe the being of the cosmos has a kind of experientiality to it, but not the kind of subjectivity which we experience. And maybe we do make a mistake sometimes in fantasizing about this idea that our subjectivity could itself be immortalized. But on the other hand, we could loop this back around to one of the initial things we were talking about. Maybe our subjectivity is an eternal object. That's also possible. And intuitively, my gut tells me that somehow it's got to be both. Somehow or another, it's got to be order and chaos. It's got to be creation and destruction. It's got to be mortality and immortality somehow. And maybe that is the point where we actually let me bring this back to quantum mechanics real quick since you brought that up. If you look at rational thought in general, especially like Aristotelian logic, right? You have the excluded middle. So you've got this definitiveness of either this or that, just baked into the very cake. It's got to be A, not both. Um, and when we look at actuality, when we look at the past actualities, that is kind of what we find, except in some weird cases where we don't. But for the most part, we seem
Which
to.
ones? Which ones? Can you mention which ones?
Let me get to that. Let me get to that. I
All
will.
right. I'm very interested about. Yeah,
Um,
right.
but for the most part, it seems like once a thing has happened, it either rained last Sunday or it didn't, right? It's either on or off. But when we start thinking in this more quantum kind of way, that there are these fields of potentiality, of informing formlessness that kind of give rise to those definitive determinations, then that excluded middle seems to just no longer apply anymore. And so what that applies, it implies a number of things, one of which might be that the very structure of logical, rational thought, as it has been thus far construed, has inclined us towards looking at physicality specifically and blinding us to that which might lie within or around or beyond it. So I said that there might be exceptions to that. And so this is something I was talking about with another fellow YouTuber around here, Galahad Eridonis, he's got kind of a channel that's dedicated to, yeah, I'd call it kind of an esoteric-ish interpretation of Christianity and whatnot. And so me and him were emailing back and forth and talking about this. And he was asking me whether I thought that things were already fixed once they happened. And I hadn't really thought about this too much before, probably because I am carrying around of Whitehead in the back of my mind at all times. And the way Whitehead construes this is you have potentialities, which are always in a disjunctive relationship with one another, at least in themselves, which is to say that there's no structure to eternal objects as such until they become conceptually prehended by some kind of consciousness, and then you can get some kind of order, and then you can get actuality, and the defining feature of actuality for Whitehead is determination. So I was like, well, maybe, and he gave me an example of this, and he was talking about like some coins. He was like, you go in a room and the lights aren't on. You take the coins out of your pocket, you set them on the table. How do you really know that the order of like heads and tails is already what it's going to be before you turn the lights on? And I got to thinking about this because then I was thinking about quantum mechanics as well, where you do seem to have some kind of spookiness like this in some ways. And it occurred to me that I had actually come across something like this before within micropsychokinesis research, where you had these researchers who were working with these random number generators, cesium true random number generators. And you have these little boxes with what look like clock faces made out of light
You
bulbs. And
see, Keelan,
go
I
ahead.
have one here.
Do you? Oh, that's so cool. Yes, that. For anyone watching, that's what I'm talking about. Well, hold it up, so we can explain how it works.
Well, this is
Might not know.
a new version, but anyways,
Yeah,
yeah.
that looks way cooler. So yeah, the lights, it does a random walk left or right, just kind of back and forth based on the emissions of the cesium. And so the idea is that the person will then look at that and use their consciousness to try and steer it one way or the other. And so one of the guys who was working on this, whose name I forgot, you
Helmut Schmidt. Helmut
Schmidt,
Schmidt.
right?
Yeah.
So he wanted to see if this effect was still there, even if he ran the cesium random number generator before he had the experimental subject try to will the light to go in one or the other direction. What he found is, yes, the effect was still there. And so what he believed is that that sequence of on and off switches produced by the cesium atom, or the cesium atoms rather, even though it had already happened, it was not yet fully definitive until it came to participate in human consciousness. And so I got to thinking about this, and I was like, maybe Whitehead is actually making a mistake here by thinking that this is a kind of on and off switch between the indeterminacy of potential and the determinacy of what has already been actualized? What if there is a gradient here that has some kind of relationship to intensity of consciousness? Maybe reality only renders at a certain resolution depending on what kind of resolution it is needed to produce, right? And so that could mean that the world beyond human consciousness does have this fuzziness to it that we are in fact negating by having the kind of consciousness that can look for finer determinations. And then this gets even weirder because then you can be like, well, maybe human consciousness isn't always like that. Maybe we can actually suspend our the orientation to the world that actually necessitates those determinations. Maybe for me, when I put the coins on the table, they're already what they're going to be, but maybe that wouldn't necessarily be the case for everybody. You get what I'm saying? So anyway,
Yes.
yeah, far out
Yes.
stuff.
Well, let me say something about this because I must, and then let's climb up the cave with the rope,
Right.
hopefully finding the way out. But it's great you mentioning this because I'm investigating this kind of phenomena. That's why I have this random event generator here. It's not radioactive. This is based on quantum tunneling and so on, but it truly generates random numbers. The hardware, it's not pseudo random software. It's actually throwing purely random coins. Let's put it this way.
Yeah.
Now, there's well, you've actually explained this in your haven't you in your video about parapsychology. There's a chunk of it where you very nicely lay out the pair lab research, the random event generator research. But let me just merge this with remote viewing and tell you and everyone a brief. It's not an anecdote. It's actually I'm working with some people who have allegedly these kind of talents, right? And so I'm trying to reproduce the kind of the remote viewing experiments. I started with extraocular vision, but I'm also doing a mixture of what could be called remote viewing. Basically, you ask people, at least the way I do it, because there are many ways and some are very with clear protocols. But let's say I ask people to draw an image that's in an envelope, and we haven't opened it, but it's there, right? The envelope. And so it's like, well, how can they pick this spatial information, well, known locally, if you believe that's possible? And well, you need to do it very well, and you need to score it very well, and you need judges, and you need a proper pool of images. But in some cases, and I've witnessed this myself, they they're really good at sketching what's in that image as opposed to any other image. But lately, and this was a couple of weeks ago, I tried something a bit more impossible, which is let's not just do it non-locally in space, let's do it in time, right? So, and this has also been done in the past, but it was the first time I saw it happening in front of my own eyes. So the task is the same: draw the image that comes to mind that's in an envelope, but there'll be, let's say, a pool of 30 images, and we will choose which image you're supposed to be drawing and perceiving after you've drawn it. After.
Yeah.
Oh man, I'll show it to you later through WhatsApp. I'll send it to you. But my friend who's was this kind of talents, and that's why I'm working with him.
Yeah, you already sent me some images of that. I remember
Yes,
the one with the house and
yes,
whatnot. And yes, that was
exactly.
striking.
And
Yeah,
and so
incredible.
he drew it, and then I went with my cell phone to the internet, and there's this website where you can easily get a true random roll of a dice between 1 and 30, or however large your image pool is, and then we pick the image and then we look at it, and it was that freaking image, right? And so this immediately, puts in your face these impossible things, non-local in space and time. But then, of course, it totally crashes the operating system of a physicist because, well, we've discussed this. Okay, space can bend and time can slow down and so on. But here we're talking about causality. We're talking about something that hasn't happened yet. That not only uh, will be picked up before, but can be perceived in this way. But now let's weave it together with the two kinds of orders, right? And you were saying, well, maybe there is this back and forth between potential and actual, right? And maybe it's not even that, which is a lot to be able to think in these two terms. And I think that's why general relativity is stuck, and the clash with quantum mechanics perhaps should be solved from the quantum size nesting relativity, because relativity doesn't have these two orders, but quantum mechanics has the kind of the unitary evolution, which is deterministic in a way. You could think of it as actual, but it's then it has the collapse, which is this kind of crossing the threshold. It's even maybe a death process where you're crossing from the potential world, the virtual world of possibilities, where this law of excluded middle doesn't apply to one where it must, and that's when it's the measurement is done, right? But then you added this extra element, which is fascinating, which is maybe it's not either or of these orders. Maybe both can coexist, and so then we can bring it back to Whitehead and ask, well, could we do some sort of psychic experiment like the ones I'm describing, where, and that's precisely what I've been thinking these days, because we pick this number, I take the corresponding image, we looked at it, and it's really close. But then what would have happened if I hadn't looked at it? Because some conscious mind looked at it in the future, right? So what is it? Well, and these are all epistemic scaffolds, right? Is it telepathy, mind to mind? Is it precognition that goes through what I saw, and so on? So I was thinking of a way of not looking at the image, so that would mean like the decision is not fully completed because we've asked for a number. It means that's that image there, but nobody has looked at the image yet. And so would the person be then able to draw it, or maybe not, because it hasn't been fully actualized? I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but what I'm trying to say is that this crazy shit can in principle be empirically tested, and it can inform back hardcore physics in an incredible way. And that's why I think, and I'm very excited, and you can tell because I get why consciousness research on those phenomena. It's like, as I was telling you before we went online, it's like going around the world, and you come back at the other side, and you're doing hardcore theoretical physics. They meet, these kind of phenomena meet, and they can be tested, and maybe these crazy parapsychological experiments can inform those who are trying to build theories of everything, if only they would entertain these different orders and their interplay and their resolution, their hybridization. Well, I'll stop here.
Yeah, so what's interesting about that though is I wonder, okay, so you have the person draw the image and then you select the image afterwards and then you compare the two before you looked at the original image. So in that scenario, assuming the images do line up with one another in a striking way, is that because the selection of the image was retroactively affecting the person drawing it, or is it because the image that was drawn was itself in a superposition? Like, what would that be like? I mean, the implications for consciousness are absolutely nuts, right? Because, if somebody drew that image, then somebody actually, sat down and drew it. So imagine being in that situation and then the image turns out to match the thing, but then you're told that the actual act of drawing the image was indeterminate until the image was selected. That's a wild thought right there. I mean, that is nuts. That your entire past could be like that in a way. That maybe in every moment you are actually collapsing the wave function of your entire history. I mean, that's pretty far out, but I mean, why not? I mean, who knows? That could definitely be the case. But with regard to potentiality and actuality, though, um, it's interesting here because you mentioned Einstein and quantum mechanics. So Einstein really, in a lot of ways, what he was trying to do is he was trying to do what Newton thought was impossible. Newton did not believe that there could be a mechanistic understanding of gravity. A mechanistic understanding, by definition, is always going to be one where you have initial conditions and then you have some kind of function and that spits out a specific output. Newton just didn't think you could do that for um, for gravity, because gravity seems to operate at a distance, irrespective of time and space. And Newton says, look, I'm not even pretending to give you a theory of how this works. Here's the equations. They just describe what's going on. And Newton had no problem with that. Newton didn't, pull his hair out looking for an explanation here, because he believed that in reality, the actual cause just was not physical. It was divine in some sense. And therefore, as Newton saw it, that lay beyond the purview of what natural science could do. And so Einstein comes along, and then he is trying to utilize the tools that he developed in special relativity, specifically the deformation of space and time, as a way to do what Newton could not. And I just feel very strongly that Newton actually got it right the first time. That what's going on here is actually not physical, strictly speaking. And I think that's really what you have in quantum mechanics too. These fields, I don't believe, are physical, strictly speaking. They are maybe in some sense distributed or kind of intensified within particular regions of space and time, but they are the not yet decidedness of possible decisions. Whereas, as I mentioned previously, there's a sense in which our rationalistic mode of consciousness necessarily tends, well, maybe not necessarily, but it generally tends to orient
Yeah,
us
yeah.
towards that which has already been determined. And this is really interesting, because that's exactly what physics was trying to do when it stumbled across quantum theory. If the past was necessarily always fully determinate, maybe they would have never found it. But because they weren't looking for something behind or before the physical, they were looking at the physical and began finding these indeterminacies in past actualities, in the actualities that have already been actualized
Yes.
and are therefore already observable, and therefore you would think should be definite, should be decided, should be complete. And what they found was incompleteness. So
Yes. Yes. And that's why a message that an image, a metaphor that I often use, and we were discussing, by the way, before starting recording, that we need to go beyond cool metaphors and into the real thing. And I hope we can continue doing these offline. But
yeah.
and this last, as I tell you, this last weekend, I was in this conference, and they had hired this huge arena, which a proper stage, a really huge place. And so I gave the talk there, and I attempted something a bit scenographic, which is as I was telling them about physics and neuroscience and what the quantum physicists were trying to look for. I went towards one side of the stage, and I went through the backstage behind the curtain, and I ran all the way to the other side, and I appeared on the other side. And that was unexpected and funny, and people laugh and clap, because as I was saying this, I say, well, these guys were looking for these, and they appeared on the other side. And it was very visual that they weren't expecting like the pseudo magician to do that. But now that we're talking about this, I think this is an initial good way of trying to think about that, because there are different realms of the real, and maybe that's what we can discuss our next week or whenever we speak. Because what's at the stage, what everybody sees would be like the actualized, maybe deterministic, sometimes chaotic, but anyways, the what we usually say is the real world, which is what measurement gives us and so on. But then the backstage could be this other order of physics, which is the quantum world, the world of potentials, right? And there are things, if things just come from the backstage to the main stage, some really weird things. While things are on the stage, everything is kind of fine. But if something goes behind and then appears somewhere, then it seems unthinkable from a stage point of view, because what happened, unless you know there's this backstage. And I don't think this is just constricted to physics. Like the other day, I was talking on Zoom with Patrick Harpur, the author who wrote Daimonic Reality and The Secret Fire of Philosophers. And he was telling me that the imaginal world is as real, if not no more real than the kind of literal world. And this goes back to Kurzweil and this idea that technology is somewhat taking magic and making it literal and so on. So what I'm trying to say is that there are different provinces of the real. And I think the discovery here is that beyond what's actual and actualized and measurable and objectivized, there's much more going on, and these characters come in and out from the backstage and they look so weird, but they're there.
Yeah, and I mean, really, the very idea of measurement itself implies definition. It implies that when you put the ruler to the thing, that it's the object is going to line up with one of your little check marks, right? It would be very strange if we did that and something was in this kind of fuzzy medium area where it's in between. But that's what we find at the quantum level, for sure, which is really crazy. It definitely indicates there is this magic, as it were, within what makes the world tick. And it really is a shame that people, like, once again, bring this back to Kurzweil, don't believe that. Kurzweil thinks that we have to make the magic. And that, I think, is really the core of this.
Mm.
Kurzweil is, and really just the transhumanist thing in general, is a very, very, very deeply Christian movement that has absolutely no idea that that's what it's doing, because it wants to achieve theosis. It wants to achieve spiritualization. But if you go back to, the Christian tradition, back to the Gnostics or to the medieval
Yeah,
alchemists or
yeah.
whatever, the driving impulse of that ideal has been the spiritualization of the bodily realm, transmuting lead into gold. And really, I think the project here, if we zoom out far enough, is this idea of using technology to aid in this process of the spiritualization of human beings, or spiritualization of nature, of imposing indeed a kind of order on the world, but not the kind of rigid mechanical order necessarily, but rather something more reflective of the let's say the intrinsic harmony of nature itself, which has been maybe compromised in certain ways by human rationality. So we're maybe kind of following the circle all the way around and coming back home. But for Kurzweil, it's not like that. For the transhumanists, the way they see it is not that they are trying to spiritualize the bodily realm through some kind of spiritual practice. They don't believe that there is any spiritualness in nature at all. And so instead, their goal is to achieve the spiritual by endowing technology with
Mm.
spiritual
Yeah,
properties. And so it's literally just an
yeah.
inversion of the project of medieval alchemy. And they have no idea, because of course they're not gonna like actually read the medieval alchemists. They don't care. They think those people
Yeah.
were backwards bumpkins who had no idea what they were talking about.
Well,
So
it's a double betrayal, right? It's a double betrayal because they're doing that without knowing they're doing that, and so they're not doing either one thing or the opposite. It's just failing at doing both. And as you were saying this, it came to mind something that was at least funny to me, which is that transhumanism is like a joke explained. It's like because it's like spirituality made literal, right? It's like, well, here's this joke, and now I'm going to explain it. Well, it's not funny anymore. It's like you just kill the magic out of it but you're doing with all your goodwill. You want to explain it. No, no. And I think that's what they're doing. It's like, yeah, joke explained.
Yeah,
Ah,
when eternal life is literally just like your ego lives forever, that becomes a lot less appealing, you
yeah,
know?
and it's not even in a cloud. It's in a fucking farm somewhere in the middle of nowhere with all these air conditioning machines, right? So all the glamour is gone, right? This ethereal idea of, well, upload it in the farm. No, you're in a fucking terabyte server somewhere in Arizona, right? So that's your graveyard. I mean, I'd rather be under the ground, you see?
But yeah, that's the graveyard, and then their heaven is, I guess, living in this like metaverse, like playing video games and watching porn all day or something like that, which again, just it seems like it would lose its appeal very quickly to most people. But
Yes. Okay, one last thing, and I know we're running out of the time we set for ourselves, but maybe let's leave this open and not respond it. But something that came last week offline and that I want to bring here, because it
yeah,
kind of in a way wraps up this discussion about death and so on, is let's go back to Dennett, right?
yeah.
He passed away, good old man, rest in peace. Now, to what extent all that he knew, and for many people he's this incredible thinking figure, perhaps not a wise man but truly a heavyweight intellectual. All right, as not after death, I'm not asking what is he thinking now, which could be a sequel to his book. I've been thinking, what are you thinking now? But as he was approaching that moment, as we will all do, unless those who go to the farm heaven, of course, will, did that help in any way, right? Because there's this sentence, I don't recall who said it, but that philosophizing is learning to die or preparing for death. So
Plato.
did it make any difference at all, or the lovely farmer next doors, when it's time for him to die, will he have a sweeter, more conscious, more harmonious transition than the great horsemen of materialism, right? And I'm using Dennett here as a salient example. I have nothing for or against him. I'm just wondering, because it applies also to me, books and discussions and eternal objects and all of that. Well, when it's our turn, will this make any difference? Or are we just terrified at the prospects of disappearing, right? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think ultimately the answer to that, which I'll state very briefly so we can pick back up on this next time, but I think it really boils down to what that kind of self onion, as it were, looks like. Where does it end? Um, uh, do you feel the world to reside in that not quite me, not quite other gray area, or do you feel your selfhood to be contracted into this little pinprick that is in danger of winking out? And so then the question becomes, if that's or something like that is what's in question for our ability to actually contend with death, then how might maybe philosophy's goal, as Plato states it, be to somehow prepare for that transition by somehow allowing those boundaries of the self to be made more malleable than they might otherwise be. So yeah, we'll pick back up on that. That sounds great. Yeah.
So good philosophy will be psychedelic then, right?
Yes, I think it would have to be. It would have to be
Yeah,
challenging on a
yeah,
very like personal level. Yes.
yeah. All right.